Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a hot topic, the Cowichan tribe's historic win of their rights and titles along the Fraser River. I want to give you a perspective. I'm going right to the court document. I'm only taking excerpts out so that maybe you understand the history. And this is meant to provide information only. I am First Nations, full disclosure. I'm from Lower Similkameen Indian Band. We don't call ourselves First Nations, we're Indians. Indio, meant the children of God. We're proud of it, we own it, we're Indians. We're Indians under the Indian Act. Indian is not a dirty word, okay? Status Indian is not a dirty word. We never had any say when Mr. Cowichan in Central Canada of the Northern Indian Brotherhood coined the term. Nobody was consulted. One, nation or province doesn't make the decision for everybody. So I am an Indian, I will refer to that. There's nothing offensive about it. I'm very proud of my heritage and who I am. And I do believe all people are equal. So I'm going to come from that viewpoint. I'm also going to just give you the information. I don't have all the answers. And maybe I'd love to hear your feedback on what you might think some of the solutions are, because this affects us all. Okay, so let's move on. So this is the map. You can, if you just Google under the court case, I provided the link in the first ad, you will see the lands that are in question and rights and titles. I'm going to go through and explain that to you because I think unless you understand all that, it just doesn't make sense, and you'll wonder how could this be, and the fear mongering out there, this is a land grab, this is that, and this is this. We need to just get back to reading the documents ourselves, processing the information. I can't read 600 pages of legalese. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a CPA, and what I want to do is just give you my understanding when I read the executive summary and share that with you, okay? I'm going to share the source documents, the links with you, because you need to be able to research and do your own decision making and input to the government and discussions with Indigenous peoples. We all live together. We need to tackle this together. So here's the background of the history of BC. This is going to be really important. I hope I've made it easy to understand. I've grown up with it, so I know this. I've lived it, okay? So this comes right, again, I always put the link at the bottom of the screen. This comes right from, the province of British Columbia. It gives you the history of treaties in BC. And then what it talks about, first of all, is, the Royal Proclamation, 1763. Yeah, let's get past the boring history and let's find out why is BC different. So what the Royal Proclamation stated that the British Crown could take possession of lands from Indians by treaties only. So, in most of Canada, the British Crown established treaties with First Nations. But BC was different. The process was never completed because we didn't join Canada until July 20th, 1871, and we were under the terms of the BC Union. We had no treaties. The province did not recognize Aboriginal title and believed there wasn't need for it, apart from the Douglas treaties. Okay, so James Douglas was the government of the day, and because we joined a little bit later, he didn't see the need, and we'll get into that. So right now, the Douglas government, in breach of Article 13 of the terms of the Union with Canada, granted title lands without constitutional authority. So in essence, what the government did, British Columbia, even though they were part of Canada, we didn't have treaties, they sold lands that restricted fur reserves to settlers. So that's why we're in the mess we are today. Now, listen, this wasn't even tackled till 1991, the BC Treaty Commission was formed. You saw all these lawsuits, throughout history. West Bank, for example, because I'm part of the Silk Nation Alliance. There are brothers and cousins and sisters and mothers and aunts over there. They, in the 70s, they sued, land for lands. And that was because what the Douglas government did of the day, and I'm paraphrasing you guys, this is my oral knowledge passed down to me from family and living through it. is they allotted lands to all of us. We don't have treaties. We're rights and titles. And so what the government did is they took land away from Kelowna, the Kelowna and Vernon, who were one at the time. And they said, well, you don't have enough people, so you don't need the land. And so back and forth, they gave us land, they took it away. They gave us land, they took it away. It's the truth. So in 1991, the BC Treaty Commission was formed to solve these issues. Here we are, some 34 years later, some 10 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 2015, when the report was issued. And why aren't we resolving those issues? Why do they drag on and on? Because they cost all of us money. We're all paying taxes. It's ridiculous. So what does the First Nation face of BC look like today? So we got three types, if you will, First Nations. I call us Indians. So you had the historical treaties, okay, where James Douglas, made 14 purchases of land between 1850 and 54 at the request of the British Crown, known as Douglas Treaties. But it wasn't a formal treaty process. The federal government negotiated with the First Nations of northern BC. Now this is the first real treaty. Treaty 8 concluded in 1899. And that followed, Northeast British Columbia, 8 more nations in the north. So they did settle under Treaty 8. I did work with McLeod Lake at the time, and they settled, okay? But what happened to the southern parts of the province? Well, this is what happened. We never signed treaties. That was the problem. The government just gave us amount of land based on our population, and then they took the land back and sold it, and then, we had to sue to get land back so we can support ourselves. As you're probably all aware, there's a real shortage of housing on reserve. A lot of us can't even go home and retire. We're away from our communities, and that's what happened as our population grew because they took the land away. So can you imagine if we had our original lands without them to keep selling, we wouldn't maybe be in part of the housing crisis we're in today because we could all be living where we belong in our communities. So in 2014, really important court case, you guys, if you want to read up on it, the Tshilqotin rights and title case, the test for Aboriginal title, it set the precedent. And a lot of us backed it. I just want you to understand. We funded it, we backed it because we hadn't signed treaties. And this forced the province to recognize our traditional territories where we fished, where we lived, where we hunted, because we were nomadic people. And just to give you a little bit of history of how heinous it was, the provincial government of the day lured, 6 chiefs to a meeting, for discussions, and then they hung them all. It's a really sad history, a very hurtful history, but it also showed the Tshilqotins Nation coming back and fighting back. That was really a heinous crime by the government, all right? So this court case is very important to us as Indians, First Nations people. We got our land back. Now, I just shared a link with you, Indigenous Foundations at UBC. It has a lot of history. It's got archives. If you want to learn and do some research, just Google the Tshilqotin Nation case. It's very interesting. And there's a really good book out there about Chief Klatassine, what happened. It's well written by a Canadian journalist. I believe he's from British Columbia. And it'll give you the background for what you need to understand some of the heinous crimes that existed and why we're in the mess we are today. So now today you got final agreements. We're coming out of it. So in 2000, the Niska, they reached an agreement with Canada, and basically they signed away their tax rights and they pay taxes, they work, and that has just been reversed under the Trudeau government because he said, well, they don't have to pay taxes. And so we finalize the treaty and then we reverse it. That's also confusing and messages. And again, I'm not against lawyers or anything like that, but everything gets tied up in the courts and we know where the money is going and the taxpayers continue to pay, all of us. And if you think that Indians don't pay taxes, we do. Tawasin just reached their, their final agreement, 2009, and then even as current as If you check on the CRA website, you can see all of the administration agreements with all the First Nations. And you can see that they've negotiated their own taxes. And because here's the thing, we don't have the infrastructure. So for example, we still use Canada Revenue Agency because we don't have the framework to build another tax authority, those sorts of things. So we use the hospitals, sometimes the same hospitals. We use sometimes the same schools, not always. We use sometimes, we use the same roads and that. So, I mean, you know, this is where when you have Indian bands, First Nations living across each other, you know, on the same land reserves, sharing resources, these new agreements are coming up. And it's also writing us out of the Indian Act and giving us more autonomy and accountability and helping us stand up for ourselves and develop in a way that works for us. So just the modern treaties, you want to read up on them. You know, they've signed separate agreements. These are custom agreements. They're not under Indian Act. You know, they're self-governing nations is what they are. Okay, next. Apologies, I'm having problems with my double screen. I'm an educator, I'm not a... So let's take a look at the executive summary. And again, there's the link for you. I would go and read it. It's not that bad if you just hone in on the core issues. If you want to read 600 pages of legalese, that's up to you. So basically, I filled you in. In 1853, James Douglas told the Cowichan Indian tribe, that the Queen had given him a special charge to treat them with justice and humanity as long as there was peace within the settlements. So that was a promise. Was it formalized? No. See, it's the Douglas Treaty. And constitutionally, it's a constitutional principle that the Crown had to act honorably in its dealing with Indigenous people. And you can read that. So then, what Douglas did between 1859 and 60, he appropriated. He essentially, you know, removed Indian settlements from the Crown's land disposition. So the land that they had bought for reserves for Indians, he took it away. And these properties, just so you know, they were restricted funds for Indian reserves as they grew. Okay, there it is, paragraph 1838. And then it gives you a history. The importance of the court case is we have to reside and occupy the area, and we have to use the resources in our traditional ways. It's a colony, those sorts of things. But he literally took the settlements that were in trust for future reserve creation, and he sold them. Very simply. This is what he did. See? 1871, the Crown grants fee simple interest over the whole claim area. So all the lands that were purchased and put aside for us, including the Cowichan title lands. The first purchase was made by a settler, Richard Moody, who was, interestingly enough, the first Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works. No conflict of interest there, right? So they worked around it, as government does sometimes, and so we lost our traditional fishing places, hunting. You know, we were nomadic. We would move in the summer to the mountains where it was cooler, you know, we would come down in the winter close to the ocean, or, you know, where it was warmer. So those were our traditional lands, and it really did. Where do you get your food? Because you're following the food chain in a lot of cases. I'm putting this in very simple terms. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm explaining this as a First Nation Indian member of my community and my understanding of my history that I grew up with, as was explained to me by my grandmother and her grandmother before her. So we did fill you in that when BC was admitted, so Article 13 of the BC Terms of Union, you can go look that up. It was extended to appropriate Indian settlements post-Confederation, okay? It limited the province to sell land without first dealing with the Cowichan interest. Well, this Douglas, what he did, he didn't ask them. He just took the land and sold it to Mr. Moody, who happened to work for the government. So that's why we're in the mess we're in, okay? And we'll talk about how we move forward. So, in essence, the sale, or the fee simple title granted on the Cowichan lands were made without constitutional authority. Okay, because they were made under legislation that was limited by Article 13 in the BC Terms of Union. Okay, they granted fee simple interest and deprived the Cowichan people of their village lands, severely impeded their ability to fish on the Fraser River. And the map was included at the beginning of this presentation. So here we go. Here, in the final summary and the argument on the case of the court's ruling, they talk about that no, there is no displacement of Cowichan's Aboriginal title and that sort of thing. This is the arguments against it, and they say there's no conclusive evidence. I thought there was conclusive evidence, but we'll move to the next slide and see what the what the courts decided in their 6 points. Summary of the court's ruling and the 6 declarations. Okay? Accordingly, the court makes 6 declarations, which are summarized below. So the Cowichan do have title to the lands under Section 35 of our Constitution Act. The Crown grants fee simple interest in Cowichan lands unjustifiably infringing on the Cowichan's Aboriginal title. And it talks about, except for Canada's fee simple titles interest in certain lands, it's talking about the airport here, and that the interests in the Cowichan lands are defective and invalid. So what does that mean? So they're going to go down and say Canada owes a duty to Cowichan to negotiate in good faith. It's not a land grab. It's, it's negotiate in good faith reconciliation. Here we're back to Truth and Reconciliation, 10 years old, of Canada's fee simple interest in the Vancouver airport delivery. And that makes sense. Okay? Then it talks about the province of BC and its duty to negotiate terms in good faith. All right? Truly, as we could see, it was James Douglas that caused all these problems to begin with. And wow, what a mess it leaves all of us in, right? So Cowichan's very excited, of course, because they get access back to their traditional fishing area and that sort of thing. Here we go. The story's not over again. So British Columbia is appealing the Cowichan Aboriginal title ruling, which, after what we just read, it was really the province that breached the Article 13 of the BC Union Agreement, and, conflict of interest, clearly in my mind. If you see it otherwise, let me know. And Canada, of course, has to settle this because they trusted the Douglas government. So there you go. Be careful who you put your trust in. But what I want to put out there to you guys is research this for yourself. And how do we resolve this? We've got to quit getting tied up in the courts, over and over again. We need to settle all of this for once. I don't have a lot of recommendations or solutions. I know that if you want to look up the history of Lower Similkameen Indian Band, we had an incident where there was some fee simple property, and all our ancestors' bones were buried on the property. They were digging it up, and we didn't expropriate the land, and we paid fair market value for it. We want to be reasonable as well. We recognize the importance of working together, and recently we also worked together with the city of Karamias. I feel like we're building more and more bonds together, and which we should, because a lot of us intermarried, because we can't marry each other. We're related. So just so you know, the Sylix Nation Alliance goes from Vernon, the head of lake, all the way down to the U.S., and we are all related. So who are you going to marry? You can't marry your first cousin or things like that. So I'm sort of pleased to see the direction that my nation is going in. And I guess what I would hope is if there were any land expropriations, and I'm not saying there's going to be, that we work down and we calculate what's fair and reasonable. You know, the land values back then versus now, the infrastructure, all these arguments that come into play, the trauma caused back then, the trauma to people now. So, you know, those are things that I think about back in my head, and there's always got to be a solution. I'm a firm believer in solution, but I'm not a firm believer in governments tying things up in courts and stuff like that. And, you know, as an Indian person, I mean, you know, 200 plus years of the government dominating and beating us down. I mean, and now, you know, just as a regular Canadian, I think I'm a regular Canadian anyways, whatever you want to call it, I don't see that continental divide between settlers and Indians that maybe a lot of people see. I just see that we're all part of the human race. We all are equal, and I think our leaders taught us that. You know, if you look up Chief Joseph Nez Perce, Chief Dan George, Chief Peguis, Chief Tecumseh, you look at all those things, and we wanted to be equal. You know, we had to get educated and understand the government because we always thought we were dealing nation to nation, and we didn't. We were not. We were being conquered in a different way, and maybe not always the best way, but here we are today. So you guys, this is a really hot topic. I don't want to be controversial. I put this out there in simple terms so people can understand why. I'm reading the fear that some political leaders putting out there that your land may not be your land. I think in today's world we could all sit down at the table and figure out how this is going to work and find a solution. And I honestly don't know right now what the solution is. And I would love to hear from you. I think Indigenous leaders need to be engaging, not just with the government, but with the people, the province. You know, what about plebiscites? What about, you know, everyone having a say, not just one side? And, you know, I am seeing some things out there that create concerns for my friends that are not status Indians under the Indian Act, you know. So please, I've rambled on long enough. I'd love to hear from you guys and your views, and maybe it's time to start sending petitions or something, I don't know, to the government. Have a great day, everybody, and wish you all the best.